On a late spring morning in the third year of global conflict, 7 heavily modified bombers sat motionless on the concrete aprons of an airfield in the English countryside. The date was the 29th of May, 1943, and these aircraft represented something entirely new in the aerial war being waged across occupied Europe. These weren't ordinary flying fortresses, though they shared the same basic airframe as the hundreds of other B-17s scattered across East Anglia's fog-shrouded bases. These 7 machines belonged to the 327th Squadron of the 92nd Bomb Group, and they'd been transformed into something the planners at Wright Field in Ohio called the YB-40, experimental gunships bristling with enough machine guns to make them look like flying porcupines. 16 50-caliber weapons protruded from every conceivable angle, turning what had been designed as a bomber into a pure fighter killer meant to shepherd regular bombers through the gauntlet of German interceptors that rose to meet every formation crossing into Reich airspace. The crews moving around these aircraft in the pre-dawn darkness were conducting their final checks before the mission that would mark their combat debut, though few of them understood they were about to participate in an experiment that would ultimately fail in its primary objective, while simultaneously exposing a design flaw that had been systematically killing American airmen ever since the 8th Air Force had begun operations over the continent. The problem these experimental gunships would help reveal wasn't related to firepower or armour or any of the complex systems the engineers had laboured over. Instead, it concerned something so fundamental, so apparently obvious in hindsight, that its oversight seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Yet there it was, written in the blood of countless young men who'd died not primarily from enemy action, but from their own aircraft's inability to let them do their jobs effectively. The issue centred on 2 positions deep in the B-17's fuselage, roughly midway between the wings and the tail. 2 waist gunners stood there during combat operations, one on the port side and one on the starboard side, manning flexible 50-caliber Browning machine guns that protruded through rectangular openings cut into the aircraft's skin. These openings measured approximately 2 feet high by 3 feet wide, and the fuselage at this location was barely 10 feet across at its widest point, tapering as it ran aft toward the tail section. The 2 men stood directly across from one another in this confined space, and during combat at operational altitude they wore sheepskin-lined flight suits bulky enough to make movement difficult even in open spaces, flak vests that added 30 pounds of dead weight to their frames, parachute harnesses with straps and buckles that caught on everything, oxygen masks connected to regulators by corrugated hoses, and electrically heated gloves that barely kept frostbite at bay in temperatures that routinely plunged to 60 degrees below zero at 25,000 feet. When German fighters attacked from the beam, which they did constantly because they'd identified this as one of the flying fortress's most vulnerable aspects, both waist gunners would attempt to track the same target, swiveling their weapons on their flexible mounts while the 200-mile-per-hour slipstream shrieked through the open windows and buffeted them with enough force to knock a man off his feet if he wasn't braced properly. In the chaos of these engagements, with the aircraft pitching and rolling through evasive maneuvers while tracers stitched the sky and cannon shells detonated against the aluminum skin, these 2 heavily encumbered men repeatedly collided with one another. They crashed into each other while trying to track fast-moving targets. They tangled their oxygen lines until the connections separated and precious oxygen began venting uselessly into the slipstream. They fouled each other's ammunition belts until the guns jammed at precisely the moment when defensive fire was most desperately needed, and they died. They died from hypoxia when their oxygen supplies were interrupted at altitude, where consciousness lasted perhaps 15 seconds without supplemental oxygen. They died when their guns jammed and German 20mm cannon shells found their aircraft. They died from the accumulated effects of a design that had never been tested under actual combat conditions, created by engineers who'd worked from peacetime assumptions about how aerial warfare would be conducted. What happened over the following 18 months would transform not just the B-17 Flying Fortress, but would establish principles of combat-driven design evolution that would influence military aviation for decades to come. Through brutal experience purchased with the lives of young men who'd never seen their 25th birthdays, through systematic analysis of what worked and what didn't in the crucible of combat over Germany, and through the remarkable industrial capacity of a nation that could identify problems and implement solutions across thousands of production aircraft with unprecedented speed, the Flying Fortress would evolve from a fundamentally flawed weapons system into the most heavily defended bomber in aviation history. The modifications that would emerge from this process, particularly the revolutionary decision to stagger the waist gun positions so the two gunners no longer operated directly opposite each other, would save thousands of American lives and contribute decisively to achieving the air superiority that made the strategic bombing campaign viable. The mathematics being calculated in the operations sections of bomber groups scattered across the English Midlands in early 1943 told a story of unsustainable losses. The operational research teams, staffed by mathematicians and statisticians who'd been pulled from universities and corporations to apply their analytical skills to the problems of aerial warfare, had crunched the numbers and arrived at conclusions that were as definitive as they were horrifying. The average B-17 flying combat missions over occupied Europe survived approximately 11 sorties before being shot down, crashing on landing with catastrophic damage, or being written off as beyond economical repair after limping home with structural damage too severe to fix. Crews were required to complete 25 missions before they could rotate home, having fulfilled their combat obligation. The probability calculation was straightforward and merciless. With an average survival rate of 11 missions, the statistical likelihood of any individual crew completing a full tour stood at roughly 27%. Those numbers translated into tangible realities across the airfields of East Anglia, where American bomber groups had established their operations. Empty bunks in the corrugated metal Nissen huts that served as quarters. Lockers being emptied of personal effects, photographs and letters, and the small mementos that young men carried into war, all packed into cardboard boxes for shipment home to addresses in Iowa and Texas and Pennsylvania, to families who'd already received the telegram informing them that their son or husband or brother was missing in action over Germany. Replacement crews arriving on a weekly basis from training bases in the American Southwest, young men fresh from flight school who tried not to think too hard about why there were suddenly openings in the combat squadrons, who listened to the combat veterans with a mixture of respect and dread, understanding that the haunted look in those men's eyes came from having seen things no training could have prepared them for. The crisis had been building steadily since August of 1942, when the 8th Air Force had flown its first tentative missions over occupied France. The entire strategic framework rested on a doctrine that had been developed during peacetime at the Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field, down in Alabama, where theoretical strategists had studied the problem of how to conduct daylight precision bombing without fighter escort. The range limitations of existing fighter aircraft meant that bombers penetrating deep into enemy territory would have to fight their way to the target and back without protection, relying entirely on their own defensive armament. The theorists had concluded that heavy bombers flying in tight defensive formations, each aircraft's guns covering the blind spots of its neighbours, could generate such concentrated defensive firepower that attacking fighters would be destroyed or driven off before they could inflict unacceptable losses. This doctrine had never been tested in large-scale combat. It was pure theory, developed in classrooms and validated through peacetime exercises that bore little resemblance to the reality of combat over Germany, where experienced Luftwaffe pilots had been fighting since the war's beginning. The theory was proving catastrophically wrong. German fighter pilots, particularly those flying the brutish Focke-Wulf 190 with its radial engine and devastating armament, or the nimble Messerschmitt 109 that had been in continuous combat since Spain in the 30s, had spent years developing tactics specifically designed to attack bomber formations. They'd identified the weak points in the Flying Fortress's defensive scheme through systematic trial and error, paid for with their own losses, but refined into doctrine that maximized the bomber's vulnerabilities. They knew the B-17's blind spots. They understood that the waist gun positions, despite being manned by two gunners with powerful weapons, represented one of the most exploitable weaknesses in the entire defensive arrangement. The waist positions themselves were a product of design choices made in the late 1930s, when Boeing had been developing the Flying Fortress as a coastal defense interceptor meant to attack enemy naval forces approaching American shores. The original mission profile hadn't anticipated sustained combat at operational altitudes against single-seat fighters employing sophisticated attack tactics. When the B-17 evolved into a strategic bomber, the waist gun positions were added to provide beam defense, but the basic design had never been subjected to the kind of sustained combat conditions now being encountered on a daily basis over Germany. The B-17 E and F models that constituted the bulk of the 8th Air Force's inventory in early 1943 carried two waist gunners positioned directly across from each other in the fuselage, each manning a flexible 50 caliber Browning M2 heavy machine gun mounted on a simple pivot that allowed it to be swiveled through the rectangular opening in the fuselage skin. The environmental conditions at operational altitude compounded every aspect of the design's shortcomings. Standard bombing altitude for precision attacks on German industrial targets was 25,000 feet, high enough to make anti-aircraft fire less accurate but still well within the operational ceiling of German interceptors. At that altitude, the temperature outside the aircraft routinely dropped to 60 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in literal seconds. The 200-mile-per-hour slipstream that roared through the open waist gun windows was like standing in a hurricane composed of razor blades made of ice. Moisture from the gunner's breath would freeze instantly on any metal surface it touched. Ice would form on gun mechanisms, on the reciprocating bolts that had to cycle smoothly to fire the weapons, on the ammunition feeds that brought belted cartridges up from the storage boxes, on the oxygen regulators that were the only things keeping the gunners conscious at an altitude where the air was too thin to sustain human life. The gunners wore multiple layers of protection against the cold, starting with silk gloves against their skin, then wool gloves for insulation, then leather gloves for abrasion resistance, and finally electrically heated mittens powered by the aircraft's electrical system. Even with all these layers, frostbite was a constant threat. When a gun jammed, which happened with disturbing regularity due to the extreme cold and the inevitable accumulation of ice on moving parts, the gunner had no choice but to strip off the heated mittens and the layers beneath them, exposing his bare hands to the screaming cold while he tried to clear the malfunction, working the action manually or pulling the ammunition belt through to clear a bad round. Men lost fingers to frostbite under these circumstances, the flesh freezing solid and dying, turning black and eventually requiring amputation. Combat reports flowing into Group Headquarters and up the chain of command to 8th Air Force Headquarters at High Wycombe were documenting a mounting crisis. The mission flown on the 27th of January 1943, targeting the naval facilities at Wilhelmshaven on Germany's north coast, had represented the first American bombing attack on Germany proper, a milestone that had been celebrated in the press back home. The combat reports from that mission told a different story. Waist gunners had reported severe difficulties engaging enemy fighters attacking from the beam. The guns worked, the ammunition was adequate, the gunners were trained and motivated, but the physical arrangement made it nearly impossible for them to do their jobs effectively. When both men tried to track the same target, they collided. When they tried to avoid each other, they created gaps in defensive coverage that the German pilots exploited ruthlessly. The 6th of March mission against the Erkner ball-bearing works had seen multiple B-17s unable to defend against beam attacks, specifically because waist gunners had become entangled with each other during violent evasive maneuvers. When a pilot threw his aircraft into a banking turn to avoid fighters or flak, everyone inside who wasn't strapped into a seat was thrown around by the G-forces. The two waist gunners, standing in their positions with nothing to hold on to except their gun mounts, would be slammed into each other, their oxygen lines would tear loose from the regulators, their ammunition belts would tangle, and the guns would fall silent at precisely the moment when defensive fire was most desperately needed. Men died in these situations, not necessarily from German bullets, but from their own aircraft's inability to let them fight back effectively. The YB-40 program had emerged in September of 1942 as an attempted solution to a different problem, though it would ultimately help expose the waist gun issue in a way that forced a solution. The fundamental challenge facing the 8th Air Force was range. The P-47 Thunderbolt fighters that escorted the bomber formations could only accompany them to the German border before their fuel ran low and they had to turn back, leaving the bombers to face German interceptors alone for the deepest and most dangerous part of every mission. Long-range escort fighters like the P-51 Mustang were still in development, and until they became available, the bombers would have to penetrate German airspace without protection. Someone at 8th Air Force Headquarters had proposed converting some B-17s into pure gunships that would accompany the regular bombers all the way to the target and back, providing additional defensive firepower to help fight off the interceptors. Lockheed's Vega subsidiary, which was building B-17s under license, received the contract to convert standard B-17F airframes into these YB-40 gunships. The modifications were extensive enough to essentially create a new aircraft variant. The conversion teams installed a second Sperry ball turret in what had been the radio operator's compartment, giving the aircraft 2 dorsal turrets instead of 1. They replaced the single 50-caliber machine guns at the waist positions with twin-gun mounts, doubling the firepower at those locations. They added a Bendix chin turret mounting 2 more 50s under the nose, addressing the head-on attacks that had proven so devastating. They converted the entire bomb bay into an ammunition storage magazine capable of carrying 11,000 rounds, enough for sustained combat. They added armor plating around crew positions to improve survivability. The result was an aircraft carrying 16 50-caliber machine guns, more defensive armament than any other aircraft in existence. The first 13 YB-40s arrived at Royal Air Force Station Alconbury in early May of 1943, all assigned to the 327th Squadron of the 92nd Bomb Group. The decision to concentrate the entire experimental force in a single squadron within a single group made sense from a testing and evaluation standpoint, allowing for systematic assessment of the concept under controlled conditions. Training flights revealed immediate problems, and most of them centered on the enhanced waist positions. Despite the doubled firepower from the twin gun mounts, the space problem had actually gotten worse. Now, instead of 2 men with 2 guns trying to operate in the same confined area, there were 2 men with 4 guns attempting to coordinate their fire while avoiding collision. During mock combat exercises over the English countryside, with defending fighters playing the role of German interceptors, the gunners repeatedly collided and fouled their equipment. The combat debut came on the 29th of May, 1943, with a mission targeting the massive reinforced concrete submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire on the French Atlantic coast. 7 YB-40s accompanied 96 standard B-17s on the raid, interspersed through the formation to provide maximum defensive coverage. The mission was largely disappointing from the YB-40 program's perspective, revealing a fundamental flaw that the planners hadn't anticipated. After the regular bombers dropped their bomb loads over the target, they became lighter and faster, able to maintain higher cruising speeds on the flight back to England. The YB-40S, carrying no bombs but loaded down with 11,000 rounds of ammunition and the weight of all that additional armament and armor, couldn't maintain formation speed. They fell behind, becoming stragglers that German fighters could pick off at their leisure. But perhaps most critically, the combat reports documented severe problems with crew coordination at the waist positions during the actual engagement with enemy fighters. Post-mission debriefings with the returning crews painted a consistent picture. The waist gunners had been unable to effectively engage German fighters attacking from the beam. The additional guns hadn't helped because the fundamental problem wasn't firepower, but the physical inability to employ that firepower effectively. The men were still getting in each other's way, still tangling their oxygen lines and ammunition belts, still jamming their guns at critical moments. The 22nd of June, 1943, brought tragedy during a raid against the synthetic rubber production facility at Hüls, deep in the German industrial heartland. YB-40, serial number 4-25735, was shot down after its waist gunners proved unable to provide effective defensive fire due to mutual interference. The after-action investigation revealed this wasn't an isolated mechanical failure or a training deficiency. It was a systemic design flaw affecting every B-17 in the inventory. The combat reports and after-action analyses reached multiple organizations simultaneously, triggering parallel response efforts across the military and industrial infrastructure supporting the bomber offensive. At Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, where the Air Technical Service Command oversaw all matters relating to aircraft performance and modification, engineers began analyzing the tactical failures documented in the field reports. At Boeing's massive Plant 2 facility in Seattle, Chief Engineer Edward Curtis Wells assembled a team to address the combat feedback. Douglas Aircraft's Modification Center in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which handled upgrades and repairs for aircraft operating in the European theater, began experimenting with actual aircraft to test potential solutions. Most significantly, the United Airlines Modification Center at Cheyenne, Wyoming, established specifically to implement combat-driven improvements to operational aircraft, began systematic testing of alternatives. The solution that emerged from this distributed problem-solving effort was so simple, so elegantly straightforward, that it seemed almost embarrassing that it hadn't been implemented from the beginning. Instead of mounting the waist gun windows directly opposite each other, creating a situation where two gunners occupied the same lateral section of fuselage, the windows would be staggered. The left side window would be moved forward by approximately 3 feet, while the right side window would be moved aft by a similar distance. This offset arrangement would give each gunner his own operating zone, his own section of fuselage where he could move and work without constantly colliding with his opposite number. They could track targets independently without interference. They could feed ammunition without tangling belts. They could maintain their oxygen connections without risk of having them torn loose by accidental contact. The modification required remarkably minimal structural changes to implement. The existing window openings would be closed with aluminum patches riveted over the holes, and new openings would be cut in the staggered positions. The gun mounts themselves were identical to the original equipment. The oxygen and electrical systems required minor rerouting to reach the new positions. But the promised improvement in combat effectiveness was enormous. The first B-17, fitted with experimental staggered waist windows, underwent combat testing in early July of 1943, and the results were immediate and dramatic. Gunners reported significant increases in their ability to track and engage targets. The incidence of equipment interference and oxygen line disconnection dropped to essentially zero. The men could do their jobs without fighting each other as well as fighting the enemy. But staggering the windows alone didn't solve all the environmental problems associated with the waist positions. Gunners still operated through open windows, exposed to the devastating slipstream and the killing cold of high-altitude flight. The complete solution combined the staggered positions with enclosed window assemblies featuring plexiglass panels and improved rotating gun mounts. This configuration, refined at the Cheyenne Modification Center and eventually standardized across production, transformed the waist positions from barely functional crew stations into proper combat positions where men could operate with reasonable effectiveness and survivability. Douglas Aircraft implemented the staggered window modification first on late production B-17F aircraft rolling off their Long Beach assembly lines in August of 1943. Boeing immediately incorporated the change into their new B-17G model, which combined the staggered waist windows with another critical modification, a chin turret mounting two .50 caliber guns to address the head-on attacks that German pilots had been employing with devastating effectiveness. The first production B-17G was completed at Boeing's Seattle facility on the 30th of August 1943, incorporating all the combat-driven improvements that had emerged from 18 months of brutal experience over Europe. Lockheed Vega, building B-17S under license at their Burbank plant, integrated the modifications into their production run simultaneously. The B-17G represented the culmination of combat-driven evolution, incorporating not just the staggered waist windows, but a comprehensive package of improvements developed through systematic analysis of combat losses and crew reports. The chin turret addressed frontal attacks. Enhanced armor protected critical crew positions and vital systems. Improved oxygen systems increased reliability. Upgraded gun mounts improved fields of fire. Together, these modifications transformed the Flying Fortress into the most heavily armed and defended bomber in the global conflict. Production statistics revealed the urgency and scale of implementation. Boeing's Seattle plant would ultimately produce 8,680 B-17Gs. Douglas's Long Beach facility built 2,395. Lockheed Vega manufactured 2,250. Every single aircraft incorporated the staggered waist window design, along with the other combat-proven improvements. The industrial capacity to identify a problem through combat experience and then implement the solution across thousands of production aircraft within months represented a decisive advantage that no amount of technical sophistication could overcome. Combat reports flowing in from bomber groups scattered across East Anglia throughout autumn of 1943 documented the transformation's effectiveness. The 8th of October mission against targets in Bremen and Vegasack saw newer B-17F models with modified waist positions claiming significantly more fighter kills than older F models still operating with the original opposite window arrangement. More importantly, they suffered proportionally fewer losses to beam attacks, which was precisely what the modifications had been designed to prevent. The gunners could fight effectively because they could operate without interference. Black Thursday arrived on the 14th of October, 1943, when 291 B-17 bombers were dispatched against ball-bearing production facilities in Schweinfurt, deep in southern Germany beyond the range of any escort fighters. 60 bombers were shot down, a loss rate that approached 20% and was clearly unsustainable. The mission demonstrated that unescorted bombers, regardless of defensive improvements, couldn't survive against determined opposition. But analysis of the losses revealed an important pattern. The newer B-17G models with staggered waist windows and improved defensive positions suffered proportionally lower losses than older F models. The defensive improvements were proving their worth even in the worst air battles the 8th Air Force had yet experienced. Luftwaffe after-action reports and pilot debriefings confirmed what American analysis was showing from the opposite perspective. Major Hans-Joachim Jabs, commanding a fighter wing in the defense of Germany, noted in October of 1943 that American bombers had become noticeably more difficult to attack from the beam. The waist guns now delivered what he described as disciplined and accurate fire, with gunners able to track attacking fighters smoothly through their entire approach rather than firing in sporadic bursts interrupted by jams and malfunctions. German fighter tactics had to adapt. They developed the Werfergranit 21, an air-to-air rocket mortar that could be launched from outside the effective range of defensive machine gun fire. They created the Sturmgruppe concept, heavily armoured assault fighters specifically designed to press home attacks against B-17 formations, regardless of defensive fire. The fact that such specialised weapons and tactics were necessary demonstrated just how effective the American modifications had been. By December of 1943, the transformation affected strategic planning at the highest levels. The 8th Air Force could now contemplate deeper penetration missions with reasonable confidence that bomber survivability had improved to the point where losses would remain within acceptable bounds. General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th, reported to General Henry Arnold, commanding all Army Air Forces, that the modifications had materially improved their ability to conduct sustained strategic operations against German industry. The bombers could survive long enough to hit their targets repeatedly, which was the only way strategic bombing could achieve its intended effect of crippling enemy war production. The impact extended beyond hardware modifications into training and doctrine. Gunnery schools scattered across the American Southwest revised their curricula to account for the new staggered positions. At Kingman Army Airfield in the Arizona desert, where aerial gunners underwent advanced training before shipping overseas, instructors noted that the staggered positions meant gunners could actually apply deflection shooting techniques effectively, leading targets and firing where the enemy fighter would be, rather than where it had been. The old opposite window arrangement had made such sophisticated techniques nearly impossible because gunners spent more time avoiding each other than tracking targets. The modifications influenced other aircraft in the American inventory. The B-24 Liberator, built in even greater numbers than the Flying Fortress, incorporated similar staggered waist positions in late production models after combat reports from Europe and the Pacific demonstrated the same problems Boeing had experienced. The B-29 Superfortress, still in development for operations against Japan, benefited from the lessons learned with remotely controlled turrets that eliminated crew exposure to the environment entirely, though this came at the cost of increased complexity and maintenance requirements. The 11th of January 1944 demonstrated the cumulative effects of all the improvements. 600 B-17s attacked German aircraft production facilities in what was being called Big Week, a concentrated effort to destroy the Luftwaffes to replace its combat losses. Despite incomplete fighter escort for portions of the mission, losses remained within acceptable limits. More importantly, detailed analysis showed that the majority of aircraft shot down were older F models, while the newer G models with their comprehensive defensive improvements showed remarkable survivability even against intense opposition. The Big Week operations conducted throughout February validated the strategic impact of the modifications. Over 3,000 bomber sorties struck German aircraft manufacturing facilities, engine plants, and assembly centers in a coordinated campaign intended to cripple the Luftwaffe's capacity to replace losses. Despite fierce opposition from German fighters and anti-aircraft defenses, losses remained sustainable. The 8th Air Force could absorb the casualties and continue operations, which meant the campaign could achieve its strategic objectives. The improved defensive capabilities of the B-17G had fundamentally shifted the attrition balance decisively in favor of the attackers. Lieutenant General James Doolittle, who assumed command of the 8th Air Force in January of 1944, understood that the modified B-17Gs could better defend themselves than earlier models. This understanding influenced his decision to fundamentally change escort tactics, freeing the P-47 Thunderbolts and newly arrived P-51 Mustangs to pursue German fighters aggressively, rather than remaining tied closely to the bomber formations. The escort fighters could hunt for targets of opportunity, attacking German fighters before they could form up for coordinated attacks on the bombers. This combination of improved bomber defenses and aggressive escort tactics proved absolutely devastating to the Luftwaffe. The 4th of March, 1944, saw the first American daylight raid on Berlin, the capital of the Reich itself and the ultimate symbol of Axis power. 730 B-17 and B-24s struck targets throughout the city, while hundreds of escort fighters suppressed German interceptors. The 95th Bomb Group, equipped entirely with B-17G models, lost only 3 aircraft from their formation, while crews claimed 17 German fighters destroyed, despite facing an estimated 200 interceptors over the course of the mission. The ability to fight through to such heavily defended targets and return with acceptable losses marked a turning point in the strategic air campaign. By spring of 1944, the 8th Air Force could mount and sustain operations on a scale that would have been impossible a year earlier. The ability to routinely launch 1,000 bomber raids with losses that, while still painful, remained within the replacement capacity meant that systematic destruction of German industrial capacity became achievable. The oil campaign targeting synthetic fuel production facilities and the transportation plan striking railroad yards and marshalling centers became viable strategies specifically because the bombers could survive the required number of missions to have cumulative strategic effect. The invasion of France on the 6th of June, 1944, showcased the transformation that had occurred over 2 years of combat operations. The 8th Air Force flew over 2,000 bomber sorties in support of the landings, saturating beach defences and interdicting German reinforcements attempting to reach the invasion area. Despite operating at relatively low altitudes where they were more vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire, and despite the intensity of operations with multiple missions per day, only 26 bombers were lost across all the D-Day support missions. The modifications, the improved training, the refined tactics, all combined to create a weapon system that could perform its mission and survive. By summer of 1944, the strategic situation facing the Luftwaffe had become mathematically impossible to overcome. American bombers were harder to kill due to improved defenses, while production capacity back in the United States meant that losses were replaced immediately. Every German fighter shot down represented a trained pilot lost, and pilot training programs were being strangled by fuel shortages caused by the systematic bombing of synthetic fuel plants. The modifications to the B-17, particularly the simple decision to stagger the waist windows, had contributed to creating a self-reinforcing cycle where improved defences meant more bombers survived their missions, which required more German fighters to attack, which resulted in more German losses that couldn't be replaced. The human dimension of the transformation became clear in tour completion statistics. In early 1943, completing the required 25 missions had seemed like a statistical impossibility, with only about 1 crew in 4 making it through their tour. By mid-1944, crews were routinely completing tours that had been extended to 35 missions because survival rates had improved so dramatically. The probability of an individual crew member surviving his combat obligation had more than doubled, from roughly 27% to over 60%. Those numbers represented thousands of young men who came home instead of dying over Germany. German technical intelligence provided independent validation of the modifications' effectiveness. Their examination of crashed B-17G aircraft, carefully analyzing the wreckage to understand American technological developments, noted specifically that the offset waist positions provided far more effective beam defense than earlier models. Reports compiled by Luftwaffe intelligence analysts acknowledged that the accumulated modifications had transformed the Flying Fortress from a vulnerable target into what they termed a formidable opponent that required significant resources to destroy. Production continued relentlessly through the summer and autumn of 1944. Boeing's Plant 2 facility in Seattle employed 44,000 workers at peak production, turning out 16 B-17G aircraft every single day. The ability to rapidly implement improvements identified through combat experience, to modify production tooling and parts fabrication to incorporate changes within weeks rather than months or years, created a weapons system that evolved faster than enemies could develop counter-tactics. This industrial flexibility represented an advantage that no amount of technical sophistication or tactical brilliance could overcome. October of 1944 brought yet another milestone when B-17Gs successfully engaged German jet fighters for the first time. The Messerschmitt 262 represented a revolutionary leap in aviation technology, capable of speeds approaching 500 miles per hour, far faster than any piston-engine fighter. Despite this overwhelming speed advantage, waist gunners managed to damage several of the jets during their attack runs, proving that improved conventional defences remained relevant even against revolutionary technology. The jet's high speed made gunnery more difficult, but the staggered positions meant gunners could track smoothly through the target's flight path, getting rounds into the air where the jet would fly through them. Christmas Eve of 1944 became the largest single airstrike of the entire war when 2,034 heavy bombers struck targets across western Germany in what was essentially a demonstration of overwhelming force. Despite the massive scale of operations and desperate German resistance that included jets, rockets, and kamikaze-style ramming attacks, proportional losses remained far lower than the small raids of early 1943. The 8th Air Force had achieved true air superiority through a combination of numbers, technology, and hard-won tactical expertise. The 3rd of February 1945 brought nearly 1,000 B-17s over Berlin in daylight, striking the heart of the Reich while it was collapsing under pressure from Soviet forces advancing from the east. Despite everything Germany could still muster in defence, only 21 bombers were lost from the entire force. What would have represented catastrophic and unsustainable losses 2 years earlier was now considered acceptable attrition. The transformation was complete. The final B-17G rolled off Boeing's production line on the 13th of April 1945. Serial number 4485974 represented the absolute culmination of combat-driven design evolution, incorporating every lesson learned through 3 years of sustained aerial combat. The 25th of April marked the final bombing mission flown by B-17s in the European theatre, attacking Czechoslovakian arms factories. The bombers returned without loss, a fitting conclusion to a campaign that had cost so much but ultimately achieved its objectives. Post-war analysis conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that B-17 evolution, particularly the defensive position improvements exemplified by the staggered waist windows, had contributed materially to achieving air superiority over Germany. The modifications had transformed aircraft survivability to the point where sustained strategic operations became possible. Financial accounting revealed the modifications' value in stark economic terms. Approximately $20 million invested in developing and implementing the changes prevented the loss of an estimated 800 aircraft worth $190 million, not counting the invaluable trained crews who would have died in those aircraft. Return on investment exceeded 10-to-1 by even the most conservative calculations. The technical legacy extended far beyond the immediate context of the war. Every military aircraft designed since has incorporated lessons learned from the B-17 modification program. Crew workspace design, environmental protection, fields of fire, mutual interference between crew members performing related tasks all became fundamental considerations in military aviation human factors engineering. The idea that combat experience should drive rapid design iteration became embedded in military procurement processes, though implementing it successfully remains challenging. Veterans of the bombing campaign consistently emphasized the modifications' importance when discussing their experiences decades later. At reunions held in American Legion halls and hotel conference rooms, waist gunners who'd survived the war testified to the tangible difference between flying in F models and G models. The simple change of offsetting the windows by a few feet meant the difference between being able to fight effectively and being effectively helpless. It meant coming home instead of dying over Germany. Today, 12 B-17G aircraft remain airworthy worldwide, maintained by museums and private organizations dedicated to preserving flying examples of historically significant aircraft. Visitors who tour these aircraft invariably notice the offset waist windows and ask about their purpose, which provides an opportunity to explain how combat experience drove innovation, how industrial flexibility provided decisive advantage, how simple modifications produced profound results that influenced the course of history. General Karl Spaatz, who commanded United States strategic air forces in Europe during the final year of the war, provided perhaps the most succinct assessment of what the B-17G represented. He noted that this aircraft was designed not in factories or engineering offices, but in combat over Germany. Every improvement, from the chin turret to the staggered waist windows to the upgraded oxygen systems, came from crews who identified weaknesses through terrible personal experience. The modifications transformed what had been a fundamentally flawed bomber into a war-winning weapon system that helped destroy the Nazi regime. The transformation demonstrates something fundamental about American industrial and military culture during the war. While Germany often produced technically superior individual aircraft designed by brilliant engineers working with advanced technology, they couldn't match America's ability to identify problems through systematic analysis of combat results, develop solutions through distributed problem-solving across military and civilian organizations, and implement those changes across thousands of production aircraft within months. The flying fortress that helped secure victory over the Reich was shaped by the collective experience of thousands of airmen who'd fought and died learning what worked and what didn't. It was improved through sacrifice. It was perfected through the harsh selection pressure of aerial combat, where anything that didn't work got men killed, and anything that did work got incorporated into production as quickly as industrial processes allowed. The offset waste windows saved countless lives. The young men who came home because they could defend their aircraft effectively, who didn't die from oxygen starvation or jammed guns or inability to track targets, went on to build the post-war world. They raised families, built businesses, taught in universities, worked in factories. The modification's impact echoes forward through generations, through the children and grandchildren of men who survived, because two windows were moved a few feet apart. Simple modifications created profound results. Victory came through adaptation. This remains the enduring lesson of how America won the air war over Europe, written in aluminum and blood, and the determination to learn from experience no matter how painful that education proved to be.